This PowerPoint correlates with your Unit 2 or Chapter 2 in your book, Discover Biology. It also has 4 videos on your assignments folder along with 2 shorter videos which are going to help you understand this material. I encourage you to watch those videos first, or watch those videos if you don't understand the concepts you need here to complete your assignments. The first part of this is going to look over what we expect to see in a periodic table of elements, and then we'll start getting into sort of how different molecules work, like water and acids and bases. This will be important for both the lecture and the lab portion of the course. This first slide looks at a couple of your learning objectives, namely states of matter and energy. The first one is there are 3 states of matter. Those are solids, liquids, and gases. You can see that in the picture here, that when we look at different elements or different molecules, they move differently. And you can see the solid, they don't move. They're all packed together. Liquid, they're sort of spread out a little bit more. In gas, the molecules are actually bumping off each other. And if I show this in real form, they would actually be bouncing off the glass. And this correlates to the bottom part of this slide, which actually shows you kinetic versus potential energy. You'll notice a person pushing a ball. And the person that has potential energy means that they are there is stored energy, and kinetic energy means that there's energy that's actually being expelled at that point. So what do you need to know for biology this semester of these chemical terms? The first is that there are chemical elements, and they're comprised of atoms, and they have a smaller component called protons, neutrons, and electrons. On the far upper right, you're going to see that these atoms, like carbon or hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, right? You can see the carbon atom has these small little elements that are green that are called protons. Those protons are positively charged, and they're inside the nucleus along with the neutron, which is neutral or doesn't have a charge, and they are surrounded by these orbitals of electrons that are moving around, and you can see that these are much smaller, about 1/2000th the size of the protons and neutrons. Okay? If you look further down, you can see that the atomic number and atomic mass tell us something about each of these elements. So we're going to go to the periodic table of elements in a moment, but you can see that the atomic number tells us indeed the number of protons. Okay? So hydrogen has 1 proton, carbon has 6, nitrogen has 7. In fact, if you look on the periodic table of elements, every single one of our elements has a different number, or atomic number, because they have different numbers of protons. The atomic mass is looking at the combination of the 2 major sized subunits of an atom. That is the protons and the neutrons. Remember, electrons are very small compared to the protons and neutrons. And so the protons and neutrons come together to form what is called the atomic mass number. So atomic mass number is the protons and neutrons, and the atomic number is just the number of protons. This is looking at your periodic table of elements, and you're going to see that it's very important to understand how this periodic table of elements works. You're going to see that there are columns. I want you to focus on the very first column, which has a hydrogen on the far left. Look in the next column. That is going to have the Be, or the beryllium. That is column 2. And then I want you to skip the middle all the way over to boron, where you see a 5. That is actually going to be column 3. Column 4 is carbon, column 5 is nitrogen, column 6 is oxygen, fluoride is number 7, and then the helium is going to be number 8. Each of these columns is going to be very important for us identifying how we can expect to see the numbers of electrons, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, if we go all the way back over to the far left side, a hydrogen is actually a special item. But if we look in that column, everything that's in that column is going to basically work about the same. So lithium is going to have an atomic number of 3, and sodium right below it is going to have an atomic number of 11. Okay? Now, if we think about this, this is the number of protons. And the number of protons for lithium is 3. The number of protons for sodium is going to be 11. Now, it's important to note when we start looking at how electrons figure into this equation that these are all going to work the same way when we look at electrons. So lithium, sodium, potassium, rubidium, all of those in that first column are going to have the same number of free electrons that aren't bound up in a full valence electron shell. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The other important thing is that when we look at the blue on this page, these are all your metals. Okay. Actually, you can add in the yellow ones as well because those are metal-like. But let's stay with the blue ones for now. The pink ones are going to be your nonmetals. These two, the nonmetals and metals, will be very important when we start looking at covalent and ionic bonding in a couple of slides. So again, when you're looking at these periodic table of elements, you can either use the one that's in this PowerPoint or there's one on page T2 in your textbook. This is looking at isotopes, and isotopes are looking at atoms that have the same element, but they have different atomic masses. So what does that mean? Remember, atomic number is telling us the number of protons, and atomic mass number tells us the number of protons and neutrons. So what we're seeing here is that there are different numbers of neutrons in carbon-12 versus carbon-13 versus carbon-14. Now this is very important because carbon-14, which we will use for dating how old things are on Earth, is actually very unstable. We like to have the same number of electrons and the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and when we have too many of the neutrons, they tend to shed off. But it takes a long time for that to occur, and we can actually measure that. So carbon-14 and carbon-13 are both unstable elements, whereas carbon-12 is very stable. It has the same number of protons and the same number of neutrons in its nucleus. And you can see that because if you take the atomic mass number minus the atomic number, 12 minus the 6 is going to give us 6. So that gives us the number of neutrons. We already knew that the atomic number was the number of protons, so that's the same number. But when we get to carbon-13, that means that we have 7 neutrons for 6 protons. So it's unbalanced. And there's a reason that that's important, and we use that for a number of features. One of those is to look at how old items are. So isotopes are very unstable, we made that clear, and they break down over time. In fact, it takes a certain amount of time for half that amount of neutron to go away. You've heard of isotopes before because we use these in medicine a lot, but you probably also realize that we use these because carbon-14 has a neutron, right, an unbalanced neutron, and it takes 5,730 years for half of that neutron, that extra neutron, to disappear. Okay? So the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, because there's so little of that carbon-14 around, but we still take a ratio of those two, will give us the age of a different item. So if we have a bone or a piece of living material and we look at its absorption of carbon-14 from the atmosphere, we can see that if we look at that in combination of the carbon-12, it will tell us how old something is. So look on the bottom of the page. It asks a question. A bone has a fourth of the atmospheric ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. How old is it? Well, this is actually 2 half-lives old, or 11,460 years old. That's because each time we go from a full, we go to a half. So to go from a full to a half is 5,730 years. And then to go from a half to another half of a half, which is a quarter, is another 5,730 years. So we add those two up, or 2 times 5,730 years, and we get that 11,460 years old. At this point, you should watch this video above and note that when we move from 100% to 50% of carbon-14 in an item, we can see that there are 5,730 years. This is very measurable. And we don't have to just go from 100% to 50% to 25% to 12.5%. We can actually do fractions of that, and we can do that based on the fact that it might be less than, maybe it's 75%, or maybe it's 35%. And then we just basically fill in the number of years in between each of those. And there's some examples on your homework assignment, but please watch the video at this point. Isotopes are very important because they're used not only to help date things, but they're also used for medicine. many of you probably didn't know this, but in your brain, the cells that are using the oxygen and or glucose can actually be seen on a computer. And these computers, as you see in the left side as a PET scanner, are actually measuring how active the brain is. So we can look at a person that might be a meth abuser, and we can see that compared to a normal individual, certain parts of their brain don't light up as much. They don't use as much of the glucose. And you could also see that on the bottom part where we're looking at somebody with Alzheimer's disease. This kind of shows the decay of the brain over time as well. So these isotopes are important for many things, not just for dating things. Oh no. Now on this slide, I want to talk to you a little bit more about how energy shells or valence electrons are going to be looking at. So we really want a stable element. We want it to have full electron shells. So the more full the electron shells are, the more stable the element will be. And the whole goal is that sometimes we have to share those electrons with other elements, but in many cases, some of these elements are already stable on their own. So let's look at an example of one. And there are some shortcuts, by the way, you can write this. So one way to write this is to actually show the orbitals. And I really like that because, especially as you're getting used to it, showing all the orbitals and all the number of electrons that are there is very important. We saw that on the preceding slide, and we'll see a couple more examples of that. But on the right side is a shortcut for looking at the total number of valence electrons. For example, in the total number of valence electrons in lithium, it would have one, so you just draw one little electron. And beryllium, you're going to see 2. In boron, you're going to see 3. And carbon, you're going to see 4. Carbon is very important. We're going to spend a lot of time on that one. Nitrogen is going to have 5. And you can see the way that they're writing these number of electrons is important because it tells us how many free electrons we can share. So with regards to nitrogen, I have 3 electrons that I need to find to fill that outer orbital. Same thing with our carbon. It needs 4 electrons, so it likes to share with 4 other ones. Okay, so remember, 2 electrons fills the first orbital, 8 in each of the other orbitals as we move out. This is showing you ions, and today I want to focus a little bit on 2 that are very important, sodium and chloride, which make up salt or table salt. And you can see in this picture here that sodium actually has 11 protons. That's its, and again, remember that this is its atomic number, and it has the same number of electrons. However, it likes to give up one of its electrons. That makes it a positive 1. So when we write sodium, we usually write Na+, which means Na+ means that it has 1 electron that it's going to give up. Okay? In this slide here, you can see that chloride ion actually is different than chlorine because it has a different number of electrons in its outer orbital. Chlorine itself has 17 protons and 17 electrons, and it likes to share with the sodium we just saw. Sodium chloride come together and they share, and the sodium gave up its electron, and the chloride is going to take that electron. Okay, and you can see that chloride is often written as -1 because it has that ion in the outer shell. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when the sodium that's +1 has the ability to grab one of the electrons from our chloride. Okay, and so what we're going to see here is that the chemicals are going to form something called a bond. That means that 2 elements are coming together, and they are going to share, or they're going to give up their electrons to make a bond form. And there are 3 different types of main kinds of bonds that we'll be looking at: ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and then also hydrogen bonds. So let's look at sodium and chloride because they make up table salt, which is NaCl. And you can see this slide talks to you a little bit about 2 of the most common types of chemical bonds, ionic and covalent bonds. And again, we'll talk more about hydrogen bonds here in a minute. So let's look first at ionic bonds. Now, very important if you watch the videos beforehand, if you look at your periodic table of elements, anytime you bring a metal and a nonmetal together, this forms an ionic bond. This is very different than covalent bonds, which always forms bonds between 2 nonmetals. So you're going to see that in this case, very important concept here. Ionic bonds are when one element or atom donates an electron to another atom to fill their outer shells. So it creates two ions, one positive and one negative, and these ionic bonds are actually giving up or attracting their elements together. You can see this here because the sodium ion, the sodium atom, is actually giving up one of its electrons, and the chlorine atom is actually gaining one. And when the two of them come together, they actually have a net charge of 0. They fill their outer orbitals, and they have a really nice attraction between the two of them. But very key here, ionic bonds. The sodium gave up its electron, the chloride used that electron to form these sodium chloride ionic bonds. Ionic bonds can be broken then later by water, okay? And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Covalent bonds are different types, and covalent bonds, again, are only between two nonmetals. So go on your periodic table and you're going to see this, okay? Now there are two different kinds of covalent bonds depending on how they actually share their electrons. So covalent bonds are sharing electrons. Ionic bonds actually give up electrons from one element to the other, and you can see that here that the nonpolar covalent bonds are actually equally sharing the two items. So two chlorine atoms are actually equally sharing their outer separate electrons there, then it's going to be called a nonpolar covalent bond. Polar covalent bonds mean that one of the elements, in this case, if you look at the far left side here, the hydrochloric acid, HCl, the chloride is actually going to be having more of that electron than the hydrogen, and you can see that it forms electrons that come more around the chlorine than on the hydrogen. This is called a polar covalent bond. Let's move on to the third kinds of bonds that we're going to see a lot of this semester. You can see on the right side water molecules, which we talked a little bit about in lab, which form these bonds together, and they form that meniscus that we talked about. But if you see water, water always kind of, if you spill it on the table, they kind of pull together. They have these bonds which are basically weak attractions to each other. It's not like ionic or covalent bonds. It's more based on the way that the electrons sort of revolve and form these semi-positive and semi-negative charges. So in this case, you're seeing the oxygens have a semi-negative charge and the hydrogens have a semi-positive charge, and they link up and form these long chains, and that's hydrogen bonding. This is very important for the molecule on the far right that's rotating. This is DNA. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at DNA this semester, and you can see that these hydrogen bonds are actually the weakest of the three bonds. The ionic bonds are the strongest. The covalent bonds are going to be then the next strongest, and then you have the hydrogen bonds. This is looking at some of the properties of chemistry or chemistry of water, and you can see that water has a number of properties to it, and this is in your book as well. They attract water to water through that hydrogen bonding, and they create a surface tension. In fact, you've hit your hand against water before, and you've seen these bugs that can skate across the top of the water. There's a tension to water. The water molecules attracting to each other causes a tension to form. Also, think about the three states of matter. Water itself has a number of spaces in between the molecules, and when it forms ice, those spaces in the solid form allow it to be lighter than liquids, and that is why the ice floats on top of that liquid. They also have the property of having a higher boiling point, and we'll spend some time looking at that in lab. The last thing is, and I talked a little bit about this, is that when we look at the chemistry of water, just keep in mind that some of these properties are based on the different the states. So is it in solid, liquid, or gas form? Let's look a little bit at the chemistry of water, and I want you to think a little bit about water being the universal dissolving molecule in your body. So water has this ability to sort of form these chains of water molecules, the slight negative and the slight positive charges, and they like to pull apart things like sodium chloride. In fact, if you took sugar or salts and you put it into water and you stir it, they help break apart the molecules. So the sodium chloride, which formed those ionic bonds that we talked about before, water actually breaks apart those ionic bonds, and it actually forms its own sort of set of bonds there. Okay, so water is the key or universal solvent in this. We also want to talk a little bit about hydrophilic versus hydrophobic. So if you look on the right side, this is actually the top of one of your cells. It's looking at a plasma membrane. We'll spend a lot more time on these next week, but these plasma membranes have these little processes. On the outer region is the hydrophilic region. Hydrophilic means hydrophilia, or water loving, and it means it likes to attract things that are charged molecules. Hydrophobic means phobia, means it repels or fears something, and it means that it does not mix well with water. And you can see the hydrophilic parts are charged, and the hydrophobic parts have non-polar charges, which means they repel things. But there's a very important process that we'll talk about, these chemistry of water products. We'll talk about this a little bit more next week. Acids and bases are really important because they both affect the charges in water. And we're going to talk a little bit about balancing equations very soon here. On the next slide, in fact, we will look at how charges will affect the chemistry. And I want to indicate to you that any chemical that dissolves in water and releases a hydrogen ion is going to be considered an acid. That's like the hydrochloric acid that's in your stomach, that hydrogen that's released. Is very helpful because it helps break things down. That's an acid. A base is any chemical that dissolves in water and releases a hydrogen or a hydroxyl ion, and that one is going to actually bind up together. So if you look, acids and bases together come together and form water, H2O. And this is what gives us that ability then to have a neutral element. The last thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is this acid and base chemistry. So this last slide here is showing you an equation, and you can see that that equation has two important ions in it. In the equation, water breaks down into hydrogen and hydroxyl ions, and you can see that this is an equation that goes back and forth. So if you have more hydrogen ions, you balance the equation more towards the right, or more hydroxyl ions, you balance the equation more to the right. But if you have the same number of hydrogen and hydroxyl ions, you actually have more water. Water is neutral. It has a pH of 7. Things that are more basic are going to be have more hydroxyl ion in it. It's going to be a higher pH, up to 14, and things that are lower pH are going to have a higher level of hydrogen. This last slide talks to you a little bit about the pH scale. 14 is the highest, 7 is neutral, and 7 means that we have an equal number of hydrogen and hydroxyl ions in our solution. We can go from 0, which is very acidic, to 14, which is very basic. And again, we're going to keep that in mind that this is all a logarithmic scale, and we'll spend more time looking at this in lab. So in other words, logarithmic scale means that every time we change the pH just 1 pH, we multiply the number of ions tenfold. So if I go from a pH of 7 to 6, it means we become more acidic, and that means that we have 10 times the number of hydrogen ions from 7 to 6. From 7 to 6 to 5 means that we have a 100-fold increase. From 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 means that we have a 1,000-fold increase in the number of hydrogen ions in the solutions. This last slide is very overview, and it shows you that oven cleaners, ammonia, and antacids are more basic. They have a lot more hydroxyl ions in it, and you know this because antacids help you to make your hydrogens in your stomach acids more neutral. Neutral is things like water, milk, and blood. They have an equal number of hydrogen and hydroxyl ions. And then at the very lowest part here are the acidics, and those are things like citric fruits and your stomach acid.